Hi, y'all. All right, this is informative speaking. I am leaving the bottom part, kind of like I've done in the past. That way you can see and take notes. So here we go. And I apologize if you can hear my baby in the background. She's at a stage where she loves to hear her voice, so I do apologize. It's hard to avoid. All right, so informative speaking versus persuasive speaking. As it says, informative speeches present all sides on an issue and do not engage in advocating for one viewpoint. So here's the thing, y'all. Basically, with informative speeches, you can't say like, oh, you should do this, or like, here's why you should do. So let's say you were doing an informative speech on registering to vote and how to register to vote. In that speech, if it's an informative speech, you cannot say, like, here's the importance of registering to vote, here's why your vote counts, because that now goes over into persuasive speaking because you're advocating for people registering to vote instead of just teaching them, here's how to register to vote. So that was kind of the next the next bullet point. But an informative speech can serve as a stepping stone leading to a persuasive speech. So let's stick with the same example. If you give a good informative speech of how to do it, that can still persuade people to register to vote. It doesn't mean that you didn't do a good job and didn't stick to, I'm so sorry, the baby's screaming, and didn't stick to the right format. Just because they're persuasive doesn't necessarily mean that you did wrong in your presentation. Okay, so it can still, the result can still be people being persuaded. Yeah. Okay. I'm getting ahead of myself. I guess it just means I'm so good at, this presentation that I know what I'm going to say next. Just kidding. Okay. Types of informative speeches. So reports. So you're usually just reporting information to a group that already knows. This might be if you are working and your boss is like, hey, Jim, give me an update on where you're at with that fundraiser. So that would be just kind of a quick report. As it says at the bottom, they typically run about 15 minutes or less. Explanations include deeper understanding of something. Honestly, think of like a lecture, kind of like a long lecture. It might be a featured speaker or something, a guest speaker, something like that. Usually, not always, but typically lectures last an hour or more. Demonstrations is what you're doing, so you should know what that is. A demonstration is where you show people how to do something. You demonstrate how to do something. And then a narrative, I know that might sound kind of weird. Hopefully y'all know a narrative is a story, right? So it can be not persuasive. I meant historical, personal, self-disclosive, or amusing. Think of maybe like TED Talks. If you're into TED Talks, a lot of those include narratives, okay? And then speeches that compare are basically speeches where it's kind of like, if you remember when we talked about the chapter over outlining and organizing speeches, it's kind of the comparative advantages one, right? So it might be one where they compare this, and they're just giving you information of like, here's the differences between these two. Okay, so those are the types of informative speeches. Now let's talk about doing it right. How do you do an informative speech that is going to be effective? Again, I'm so sorry about my baby. I know this is super unprofessional, y'all, but I can't leave the house right now to record this. I apologize. Provide new information to your listeners. So it doesn't have to be like groundbreaking. They've never heard it before. You don't always know, right? We talked about with the audience, you don't always know where the audience is as far as their knowledge, but try to provide new information. Try to find stuff that's not widely known, just so it's more interesting. Assess your audience. This should always be on your list, but especially for informative, try to think about, and you're going to have to make some assumptions, but try to think about what your audience might already know and what they might find interesting. Okay. So for example, if you know that you're giving a presentation to I think I even gave this example, but it's the first thing that popped into my head. If you're giving a presentation to third graders or, middle schoolers, they're not going to find it interesting how to sign up for a retirement fund, right? Like that's not, they're not going to know that. So it'll be new, but it'll be over their head. So you still need to assess your audience. Avoid information overload. Hopefully you remember information overload from one of the first chapters we went over when we talked about listening just a reminder, information overload is where you might fail to listen because there's so much information coming at them, okay? So as it says at the bottom, separate the most important information from the information that does not serve much use. I know when we're passionate about something, that can be hard because we think it's all important, right? But even with, I'm going to be honest, even with teaching classes, I have to separate like, okay, what do they need to know? What is, is this helpful to them or do I just find it interesting? Okay. And then tell your story well. I'm not going to go over the 6 points down below. You can look at them. I'm going to be honest, I can't remember. I don't think it's in your midterm, but it's just interesting to see if you're going to tell a story, make sure that you tell your story well, because that can impact your audience and their ability to retain that information. All right. So finally, getting down to your content. So what is included besides just teaching or whatever, but what does that mean? What's included in an informative speech? So definition. So you know what a definition is. If you want a definition of the word definition, very meta. Basic knowledge so that the audience can understand the fundamental basis. Okay. You can define, I like this. You can define things in different ways. So you can define something by what it does, telling us what it does. Defining something by what it is not. I know that sounds kind of weird, but sometimes it can be really helpful of, like, okay, so this is this, blah, blah, blah. It's not this, it's not going to do this or whatever. Defining something by providing examples. I think that's really important. I have to have examples to learn. You can give me a definition and that's great, but examples really help me bring home the content so that I can really understand what it looks like. Defining something by providing synonyms. And then defining, something by giving its root meaning, okay? Description. So description basically provides a mental picture for the audience. So that's where you just describe, obviously. Demonstration. I'm not going to go over that because if you are this far in our semester and you're preparing your demonstration speech and you don't know what a demonstration is, then we have problems. Explanation is providing reasons or causes, okay, so maybe explaining why something happened or why something is the way it is, demonstrating relationships, and offering interpretation and analysis, okay? So especially with the demonstration speech, I kind of like, and you don't have to do this for everything, but it can be really helpful when you give us a step to tell us why you need to do that next or why that step is important. If it's like, oh, and you need to remove this, okay, why? What does that do, right? And then finally, counter faulty assumptions. So audience members might not completely understand something because they believe something obviously works a certain way when in reality it doesn't, okay? So what you can do is to go over and say like, okay, so here's what this might look like. Here's what a lot of people think it is. So acknowledge them, but then provide the accurate information and then say like, but actually, interestingly enough, it's actually da-da-da-da-da, okay? So that is the chapter over informative speaking. I'm going to be honest, so it's kind of short because I'm going to be honest, I think a lot of our speaking and a lot of our communication is persuasive. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the persuasive speech, but there's a lot more that is persuasive. But that's not to say that you'll never give an informative presentation. You probably will at your job a lot if it's, keeping up with deadlines and, presenting something. But I like to keep this kind of short and sweet for y'all's sake and just because, we don't need to get too into the heavy of informative. All right, that is all I have for y'all. Bye-bye.